we go. Welcome back, everyone, to the Python tutorial seminar series. Today, Anderson Banihirwe will be covering Xray. This is one part of 2 sessions on Xray, and both of these sessions will be recorded and published. Before I begin, I need to review our code of conduct. By joining this Zoom call and participating in this tutorial seminar series, you've agreed to adopt these values and engage in respectful communication only. Anything else, otherwise, we'll have you removed from the call. The seminar is only an hour long, so we will do our best to give you help during that time from the co-hosts. But just you know, like, we can get you up to speed over the 2 weeks between this session and Xray Part 2. So please, if you have technical issues, relax and know that we will do our best to help you. And some learning resources for today's session: Stack Overflow, the Xray documentation, and today's content on GitHub, which I will post in the chat to everybody in just a second. Okay, take it away, Anderson.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Let me actually share my screen. Okay. Okay. I will assume that you see my screen. If not, please let me know. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so as Julia mentioned, so if you haven't done this already, so the content is in this GitHub repo. So please clone it. There's some instructions on how to set up a local environment. But if you don't want to actually set up anything on your computer, so we can actually use this online service called Binder. If you haven't heard of it, basically we get some free compute in the cloud. So if you're like me, so today I won't be running this locally. I have some issues on my computer, so I'm going to use Binder. So if you go to this repo, and then so there's this badge here with a description saying launch Binder. If you click on that, so that should basically take you to this page, which should take like a few seconds, and then you'll be good to go. If you're running locally, you can follow those instructions in the README of the repo as well. Okay, so I did this, so I don't need, okay, I have another one here. But yeah, okay, so give me a second. Hopefully this starts. Oh, never mind. Should have been patient. So yeah, so I'm assuming that everybody's on this, at least if you plan to follow along, is on this page. If you're running locally, you should have something that looks like this as well. So the first thing that you should do is just go to this notebooks directory, and then you see so far there's 4 notebooks, but then we'll add more to it for the next session. So we're going to cover these notebooks today. So I guess I should probably start with some expectations on what we're going to do today and then in the next 2 weeks. So the Xray itself is extensive, so I won't be able to cover everything in Xray. So what I'm going to provide is some, at least something that would help you get started if you haven't used Xray before. And if you've used Xray, I'm hoping that at least there's also some new things that you may learn from this. So another thing that I won't cover in these 2 parts is Dask. So if you're coming here for Dask, I won't cover anything that has to do with Dask, at least in these 2 sessions. So there will be dedicated sessions for that. And then, so in today's session, we're going to cover these 4 notebooks. And the topics are mostly, we're going to talk about some core data structures that in Xray. We're going to talk about indexing and subsetting. And then I'm going to do some visualization. And then in part 2, we're actually going to talk about computation, and then also how to basically bring all these topics together through an end-to-end example where we actually do some analysis. So that's to come in the next session or in 2 weeks. So first thing that we should do is go to this 00-download data notebook. So the repo doesn't come with the data that we're going to use, but then I have this notebook that basically have a few functions. Oh, it's a single function for actually downloading the data locally. So I would say go ahead and run this notebook. It'll probably take between 10 and 15 seconds. And what this is actually doing, so I have a few files here, and then I have this function that basically is just downloading these files and then actually putting them into a data directory. So you should, if you run this after a few seconds, you should see a directory under notebooks called data with 4 files. And please, if you want to follow along, you need to do that because the next 3 notebooks use these data files. And if you have, if you're running into some problems, please post questions in the chat. Hopefully you'll get some answers. Okay, so now that I'm done with this notebook, so let me go back to the notebooks directory, and then let's open this Xray fundamentals notebook. Okay, so yeah, so the learning objective for this notebook is basically provide you with some overview of Xray, and then give like a brief description of the core data structure in Xray, and those are data array and data set, and some other components that make them up. And then we're going to see how to read data from, let's say, like a local NCAR file or a grib file, and also how to read data from a remote thread server. So some of the things that I think would be useful, at least, well, if you're here today, maybe it's too late, but some of the concept that might be useful, like I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with NumPy. And so that's really necessary because Xray is built on top of NumPy. And then some familiar with pandas. You don't have to, but if you know pandas, then some of these things will probably make more sense. And then I'm also going to assume that you have some experience with NetCDF. So because Xray actually builds on the NetCDF data model. So some of these things, if you've used NetCDF before, some of these things may actually easy to understand. Okay, so the environment that the environment file that I provide in the repo should install pretty much all the necessary packages. And if you're running in the cloud, this also should be done for you. So the first thing that we're gonna do is import Xray. So in most cases, you'll see people importing Xray like this. This is not a rule, so you can just import it however you want. So we're just using the XR alias here. So what is Xray? So like I said before, so Xray is a Python library that builds on top of NumPy and pandas. And it basically, if you're familiar with pandas, it basically brings the power of pandas to multidimensional arrays. If you're not familiar with pandas, I'll say, don't worry about that. The idea is that Xray is basically taking NumPy, which is an n-dimensional array, NumPy array, and adding some useful capabilities to it, like things like name dimensions. We're going to talk about what those really mean. So the core data structures are data set and data array. So as an end user, you're mostly going to interact with these two. There's some others, but they're out of scope for this tutorial. So a data set. So a data set basically, it has a couple components. So we'll talk about this in this notebook. So there's what we're going to call data vars or data variables, and then there's coordinates, and then there's dimensions, dims in this case, which is so dimension is basically a dictionary. We'll see what this looks like in this notebook as well. And then there's the global attributes, which are made available under the ATTRS, which is basically a dictionary. And then data variables are actually consist of data arrays. So a data variable is actually an Xarray data array. Same thing with a coordinate. We'll also see what this means. So a data set contains a bunch of data arrays. And then, so a data array, the way to think about it is that this is actually your actual array. So it has the data and it has some additional information like the dimensions, some attributes that are specific to that data array, because you could have a collection of data array in a data set. So attributes in this case for data arrays correspond to attributes that are specific to that data array. And then the name. So yeah, so, and the data when it comes to the data that is contained in a data array can basically be what is called in Python a DAC array. So a DAC array, if you're familiar with NumPy, basically there's a bunch of array implementation in Python, and most of them they tend to provide an API that kind of resembles like NumPy, but it's not really NumPy. So there's a bunch of these that basically you can put in a data array. So NumPy being one of them. If you've heard of Dask, so Dask array could also go into that, and then you could also put in like a sparse array as well. And if you're familiar with GPUs, there's another package called CuPy, which kind of implements NumPy on GPUs. So that also could go into a data array. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is open one of the files that we downloaded. So the way we do that, so we imported Xarray, and then we call this function open dataset. Actually, trees. Yeah. So we open a dataset, and then we give it a path to the file, and then this function open dataset supports reading data from different engines. And what I mean by that is, in this case, this is an SCDF file, but as we'll see down in this notebook, you can actually read other types of files. So in this case, I'm telling Xray that this file is actually an SCDF full, because under the hood, Xray is actually using different backends. So we do that. And as you can see, this was really quick. It took like a few milliseconds on my computer. And something else that you should probably do as we do this, if you check this widget here, it will kind of tell you the memory. And you'll see that so far, it hasn't really increased that much because we haven't actually read anything in memory. The only thing that Xray did in this case is just read some necessary information. So attributes, some metadata, and that's it. So if we're to look at DS, in this case, we can just do DS here. We're going to see a few things. Collapse this for now. So we have, as you can see, so this is a data set, as this says. So we have dimensions. So if you're to, so for now, so this is basically like a dictionary. So it's telling you the name of the dimension, the length of that dimension. And then we have coordinates. So in this case, in Xarray, at least I think this is actually like a CF convention. Okay, now I'm introducing a bunch of things. So if you're familiar with CF conventions, a 1D array that has a corresponding name dimension is actually considered to be a coordinate. So that's actually what's happening here. So we have,
Anderson?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's been a request to see if you can make the font sizes larger.
Okay, is that better? Can keep going.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, good. Okay. So yeah, so in the coordinates we have latitude, longitude, and time. And give me a second. So if you click on this file icon, it would actually give you some more information about that coordinate. So in this case, these are actually the attributes that are attached to that coordinate. So this is representing the y-axis. So you have the standard name, the title, some so valid max and mean. And if you're to click on this, I like to call it a database icon. If you click on it, it would actually show you the values. So in this case, we can see that our longitude are from minus 90 to all the way to 90. So we could do the same thing for longitude. I won't do that, but let's now look at time. So one thing that you'll probably notice here is that we have actually something that looks like a human readable time object. So under the hood, Xarray uses two packages to interpret time. So Pandas has some built-in functionality for time, but that is only tied to the Gregorian calendar. But then there's another package called CFTime, which actually supports a bunch of these other non-standard calendars. So in this case, you can see that it's actually telling us that this is actually a null calendar. Okay, so those are the coordinates. You can also see some attributes here as well. Let me do that. Okay, now if you to look at under data variables, you see that we have a couple of things. So we have our actual near surface temperature, air temperature variable, TAS. It's a 3D variable. So it's a float 32. So we have some metadata about that particular variable. So long name, like some of this stuff are just CMIP specific, because that's where we got the data from. And if you click here again, in the case of a data variable, because like I mentioned before, it's actually not loading the data, so it won't really tell you, it won't show you the data, it will just show you, in this case, how many values are in there. So we have the time bounds, latitude bounds, and longitude bounds. And if you look at the attributes, these are just the global attributes. Okay, so this is, you get this representation if you're working in a notebook. So if you're not working in a notebook, what you will see is actually text-based. And the way to do that, if you actually wanted to, even in a notebook, if you actually wanted to use the text-based representation, you can actually run this line. I won't do it, but if you uncomment this line, it will actually give you the text-based representation instead of the HTML. And then now there's this function called M4, which basically kind of gives you a corresponding SCDF representation or something close to that. So if you're to run that, so if you ever used NCDump, this should look familiar. So this is what this would look like in SCDF, or at least this is what it looks like in SCDF. So yeah, okay. Again, what did we just cover? So we open an SCDF file, which gave us an Xarray dataset. And then in the dataset, we have data variables, dimensions, coordinates, and then attributes. So we can actually look at each one of these by doing this. In this case, I want to look at the data variables. So this is how I would do it. Let's say if I wanted to know what dimensions are there, I could run that. Okay, again, this is a dictionary, so it's telling me the name of the dimension and the length. And then I can look at the coordinates as well. See, so this is the text-based presentation I was talking about. I'll talk about it later. And then these are the attributes. So the attributes here is just a dictionary. Okay, so that's an Xarray dataset. So now let's actually dive deep into a data array. So a data array, in this case, we're going to retrieve one of the variables, in this case, TAS. So the way you do that is you do DS and then square bracket and then string that refers to the name of the variable they're interested in, and then close the square bracket. And in some cases, okay, I'll skip that. I was going to say that you can actually retrieve multiple variables, but I'll skip that. So another way, if you've worked in Python, you've always seen like a notation that looks like this, where you do ds and then dot. So in this case, I can just do ds.tas. And that will basically kind of give me almost the same thing, or actually the same thing. There's a caveat though. This dot notation is limited because whatever comes after the dot needs to be something that is a valid Python identifier. I won't go into what that really means. I have some links here that actually provide some explanation. But the idea being that if you, let's say, you had a variable that had, let's say, spaces, let's say TAS, I don't know, temp, let's say air, like something like that, you cannot use this dot notation to refer to this because this is not a valid identifier. If you had, let's say, like ta.air, for instance, like something like this wouldn't work because in Python, this means something different. So rule of thumb is if you can just stick with the bracket notation. It's generic. It works in all cases. Okay, so now let's actually look at the data. So the way you do that, if you call data, this would actually read the data. And now watch my memory here. So now you'll see what I have here. And then if I do this, this would actually retrieve the data. My memory, I think, should increase. Yeah, so now you see that now it's probably like 100 megabyte more than what I was using before. This actually read the data in memory. And what we're getting is a NumPy array, which is a float of type float32. We can look at the coordinates and then attributes again. These are attributes that are specific to TAS. Because remember, we have global attributes that are just generic to the entire data set. Okay, so that's a data array. And now something that I've been mentioning a lot, so dimensions and coordinates. So what's a dimension? So the way to think about a dimension is that Xarray, so instead of referring to what usually people call axis, so you have an array, an ND array, instead of saying axis 1 or axis 0, Xarray is basically matching a name to that. So we can just say time, so time dimension, and Xarray knows what axis we're actually talking about. The nice thing about that is that you don't have to keep track of, oh, is time the first axis, is it the last axis? You can just say time, and Xarray will basically figure out what axis time corresponds to. And then labeled coordinates. So the way to think about it is that, so you have an M dimension or an axis, and on that axis you have tick labels, and those are basically what we're referring to when we say labeled coordinates. So something like, let's say if I had like the time axis, you could say this particular date. So that's a tick label on that time axis. So here I talk about the differences between the HTML, which is what we're getting when we just do this. So this is the HTML representation, and the text-based representation, which is what we can get if we do this. So this is giving you the same information. The only thing that is changing is how Xray is informing you what are coordinates. So in this case, you'll see that it would actually put a star in front of the dimension, the coordinate name, whereas in this case, it will just make, in the HTML-based representation, it will actually make it bold. So yeah. Okay, so we just covered basically how to open a data set, and then we looked at the Xarray data set and then the Xarray data array. And we're just using NCDF. But let's say, what if you're actually using, let's say, like a different file format that is actually supported? Like in this case, I don't know, maybe you work with Grib. So we can actually do the exact same thing that we did with NCDF. We just point Xarray to a Grib file, and then we tell which engine we wanted to use. In this case, we're reading this Grib file that we downloaded, and Xarray will basically just read that in. And again, this looks like like any other data set, but it's coming from a Grib file. So yeah, so that's another way if you're working with a different file format that is not NCDF. And then another convenient functionality provided by Xarray is, let's say you have access to some data that are hosted on a remote server. In this case, this is the same server that we downloaded data from, but let's say we actually wanted to access this remotely without downloading it. We can actually, so this is pointing to a threads server. If you don't know what a threads server is, okay, it's out of scope for this, but it's something that basically allows you to serve an SCDF over the web. In this case, I have the URL, and then I just pass it to Xray.open dataset. Same thing, do engine equals NCDF4, and I should be able to basically read the same data without downloading anything. And Xray is kind of behaving exactly the same way in this case, in that it's not actually retrieving any data. It just asks the server to send it some necessary information to construct the dataset, but it hasn't actually read the data. So yeah. So the summary here is, so in Xray, the two main data structures are data arrays, dataset, and a data array. So a dataset is a collection of data arrays, and data array stores the multi-dimensional arrays. And as we've seen, the dataset data structure is inspired by the NCDF data model. So that is just notebook 1. I hope I wasn't too fast, and if I was, sorry about that. Time is a luxury we don't have. Okay, so I will go to the next notebook. So how do you get to that next notebook? If you just click here, it should take you directly to that notebook. Otherwise, you can go back to the file browser, then click on the notebook. Okay, let me actually close some of this stuff. Okay, so now we've seen, okay, you've read in your file, and now you actually want to do some subsetting, or you actually want to look like a subset of your data. So how would you do that? So in this case, we're going to cover 3 ways that you could do that. So one way is selecting or subsetting data by position. And then there's also selecting data by coordinate labels. And there's interpolation and nearest neighbor lookups. Okay, so let's open the same file again. So that's our data set. So if you've worked with NumPy, for now, let's actually retrieve the NumPy array. If you've worked with NumPy, usually the way you would, so if you look at the shape of this array, so it's a 3D array. If you wanted to, let's say, like extract like a time series in this case, we can use this indexing notation where I'm saying for the first axis, I want you to retrieve everything. And then for the second axis, I want you to retrieve the, so in this case, that's so Python is 0 based. In this case, that would be the 20, no, that's not, no, that would be the 21st, yeah, 21st index on the second axis, and then the 41st axis for the first index on the third axis. So we can do this, and what we get is basically like a subset of that array, because if we do the shape here, we should basically get a 1D array. But then the question becomes, what was 20 again? Is so like in this case, and what labels, like what axis does it go with? So is it actually, is this latitude? Is it longitude? So this is where actually Xray becomes really useful, in that it actually allows you to forget about the location and just tell it what labels or the name of the dimensions, and it will basically figure out things for you. So the first type of indexing is what Xray calls indexing by positional, by integer position. In this case, this is made available through this shorthand ICEL. So index selection is how I interpret it. How that works is basically you give it the name of the dimension, and then you give it what index you're looking for. So you can provide like a single value, so just an integer, or you can give it an array of integers, or you can give it like a slice, which under the hood, Python is kind of building like a range of values. So in this case, slice 2 through 20, so basically value 2 through 19. So how does ICEL work? So if you just call ICEL without providing anything, it will just give you the original data set. And then now I'm saying for latitude, I want you to give me things that corresponds to latitude at this index, right? So as you can see, this is a 2D array. And what is the actual coordinate label that corresponds to that latitude? It's actually 4.241. But since I didn't give it a value, I'm just getting basically whatever the position, whatever is in that position. We can do, like I said, we can actually give it like a list of integers. And so in this case, I'm doing both latitude and longitude, and I'm saying the second to last, and then the last index on the time axis. We can also give it a slice, which, as you can see, I'm actually generating values 10 through 19 inclusive. So 10 through 20 and 20 non-inclusive. So yeah, so that's basically how you would select values by index in Xray. Again, I can basically put this in any order. I don't need to care whether this is the dimension that comes first. I just tell Xray the name of the dimension, and we'll figure out things on its own. Okay, so that's selecting by index. Okay, so the second type of selection is what I'm going to refer to as coordinate label based indexing. In this case, instead of telling it the index, I can actually tell the values of the coordinates that I'm actually interested in. So in this case, it can be like a single coordinate label. In this case, I can say, give me data at this time. In this case, this particular date. Or, okay, this is actually a typo. Yeah, okay, too bad. I should have proofread this. Okay. So in this case, I'm saying, give me, so this the list of labels that I'm actually interested in. Or I can also give it a slice. So in this case, Xray under the hood understands what this really means. It's saying, give me all the time values. It will basically generate time values starting with January 1st, 2021, up to March 1st, 2021, inclusive. Yeah. So I should have, yeah. I think I actually, up above, I said that was non-inclusive, but it's actually inclusive. So in this case, one thing I can actually do, because Xray decoded our time, so it has a human, I can just say, give me the data that corresponds to this. In this case, it's the year. And Xray will basically go and find everything that corresponds to 2013. So in this case, it's giving me all the data that corresponds to that year. And if you look at the time, it's basically January through December of 2013. I can be more specific. In this case, I can say, saying, give me the data that corresponds to, so this is 2 years worth of data. And again, Xray will basically generate all the values inside this range and then just do the selection and then return those. Okay, so there's a warning though. So if your labels, or if your coordinates are actually floating point numbers, because Xray is doing a lookup, it's basically finding an exact match for those values, things can actually get tricky because, as you know, floating point numbers are approximately represented inside a computer. So if you give it something like 39.5, maybe this is what, when you print the data set, this is what you see, but inside the computer is probably 39.50000. So Xray is unable actually to find exact matches. So what you run into is that if you run something like this, you actually get an error because basically Xray couldn't actually find 39.5. Okay, there's a solution to that, and this is where we get into what is called nearest neighbor lookups. The idea being, you give Xray what values you're interested in, but then you tell it how flexible you are. So in this case, we can actually provide two things to sell. So, and that is method, which usually most people will use nearest by saying, I want you to just get the nearest value. Or there's a bunch of other stuff. You can do pad or backfill. I don't go into what these really mean, but if you want to know, there's a link to the documentation page. But in this case, I can basically run the same thing and just say, so these are the latitude and longitude values that I'm interested in. I want you to basically retrieve the nearest values. So if I do that, if you scroll down, you'll see that it actually, so the nearest value is actually 39.11 and 106.2. So you can see there's no exact match for these values that I was looking for. So yeah, so be aware of that caveat if you're working with floating point coordinate labels. Okay, so again, there's other stuff. You can provide some tolerance that kind of tells Xray how basically you should do the lookup. And I don't go into that, but I provide some links to the documentation if you want to know. So if you didn't want to use the method nearest, you can actually cheat by using the slice. So in this case, I'm saying, okay, so this is the range of values. At least the values that I'm interested in fall into this range, and Xray will generate the values for these ranges, and then we'll actually return you the data. It's not as, I guess it depends on what you're trying to do, but in this case, it does the job in that I actually get, if you to scroll down, okay, this is too long. Okay, again, so those are my latitude and longitude values, but they have to fall in that particular slice object, the range of that slice object. Something else is that you could actually chain these operations. Let's say, my mouse is so sensitive. Let's say you wanted to select by index on one dimension. In this case, for time, I just want to select the first time. I don't know what that value is. You can actually change these. So do ICEL on that, and then on the other dimensions, I actually want to select by coordinate label. So this is what I'm doing here. So you should be basically able to chain these and get what you want. So yeah. And then the last point is about interpolation. So let's say actually you want Xray to give you data at particular tick labels that are actually not in your coordinates. So in this case, I can actually use the interpolation. And the way you do that is you call so ds.tas and then interp, and then the name of the dimension. And this also acts the same as ICEL and cell, acts the same as cell. So you can give it a single value, or you can give it a list of values. And you also have to tell it the method. In this case, I'm saying near list. So if we run that, what we get is basically data at those latitude values. But these are actually not in the original data set. Xray is just doing an interpolation for us. Again, there's so much about the interpolation, so go to the documentation page if you want to find out more. So that's basically how you would subset some of your data or select some of the data and do some interpolation. Okay, looks like we're actually right on time. So again, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And hopefully, so we're going to cover one last notebook. I acknowledge that I'm probably going too fast, but hopefully at some point you should be able to go to these notebooks and things will make sense at your own pace. So now let's look at the last notebook, which is the, at least for today, the visualization notebook. How do you get there? Just click on the data visualization here. This is a link, or you go back to the file system browser and then just click on that notebook. Okay, so now let's actually do something fun. So visualization. Okay, so Xray has some built-in functionality for doing quick visualizations. In the past, we've covered matplotlib and cartopy. You can still use those, but if you just wanted to, let's say, quickly look at your data, Xray has some built-in visualization that allows you to do this in a very short amount of time. So we're going to look at the built-in matplotlib backed plotting interface, and then we're going to look at, actually, if you're interested in interactive plots, how you do that. This is not built-in, so it's through a package called hvplot. I will go into that later. Okay. Okay, so do the same thing, import Xarray, read the file. Okay, so the plotting interface is provided through the .plot method, and this works on both data array and data set, but then the type of plots that you get depends on what object. So if you're plotting like a data set, you may have to do things that maybe you don't have to do if it's a data array due to what is actually contained in each one of those. So this is so this interface is it's basically building on top of matplotlib. So if you use matplotlib, some of these things will make more sense. Okay, so when you call .plot, Xray has some built-in heuristics. So the idea being, if you give it a data array and then just do plot, call .plot, Xray will basically do a couple of things. One, it will check basically to see the shape. So if it's a 1D array, it would actually give you a line. If it's a 2D array, it would actually give you a P color mesh. If it's anything other than 1D and 2D, basically anything more than 2D, it will just give you a histogram, which is probably not that useful. So let's see how some of these things work. So in this case, I'm basically doing some selection. So selecting data at this longitude value, latitude value, again, providing method equals nearest because these are actually floating numbers. So what I get is basically, actually, let me just run that. It's actually a time series, right? So say that it's basically spanning our time axis. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that you can pass in here. So the size here is just telling it the size of the figure. And then the marker. There's a bunch of other stuff that you can pass in here if you wanted to customize the plot. But one of the nicest things is you'll see that our axes are labeled. Like, so you'll see that. So if you look at our x-axis, so it's telling us what dimension that is. So that's time. And then on the y-axis, we actually have our near surface temperature. And then in this case, it's actually using some information from this subsetting that we did here. So that's the time series at this particular spatial point. Okay. Okay, there's a note here about using method equals nearest. Okay, let's do something else. So let's say, in this case, what we're going to do is basically, we're interested in these 3 latitudes and this particular time. So this is, let me see. Okay, so this is, as you can see, this is actually 3D, but then we actually, our goal is to compare or plot data at each of the 3 latitudes here. So the way you do that is actually provide this hue keyword argument and then tell it the dimension. In this case, that's the latitude. And then we're telling it what to put on the x-axis. In this case, we're telling it to put longitude on the x-axis. So what we get is basically 3 lines, right? And each line here corresponds to one of the latitude that we selected. And as you can see, it's also labeled. So you have a legend telling you what latitude each one of these corresponds to. And you also see some nice things like it will, if the units are there, we'll put them on the labels of the axis. Oh, sorry about that. My mouse is very sensitive. I don't know why, but okay. So that is 1D. So now let's actually look at some 2D plots. So in this case, I'm just selecting data at this, so 10th index from the last index, basically, and then this region, so longitude values 20 through 160 and latitude -80 through 25, and then I'm just doing the plot in here. So you'll probably see some silhouettes of the continents. This is the basics that you get, but if you wanted to, you could actually use something like CaltoPy to actually put maps and a bunch of other stuff on top of this plot to produce a prettier plot. So again, everything is labeled for us. So longitude, then you have latitude, and then you have a color bar. And as you can see, we didn't have to do anything. Xray is just going to do that for us. But this may not be perfect. At least I wouldn't recommend just taking this and putting it in your paper, because the resolution isn't that good. So you would probably have to do some customizations for something more professional, I would say. So let's look at like a few other things. Like if you actually wanted to do some customizations, in this case, you'll see that we didn't say anything about the color bar. That's what we got. But we can actually do some customization. So I can tell Xray the orientation of the color bar, the label, and then I'll just pass this through the cbar underscore keyword arguments, quargs. That's what it means. And what we get is basically something that looks like this. So you can still customize the plots through Xray. And if you're wondering about the robust equals to true, this is what it means. It's basically going to make sure that if you have some anomalies in your data, they don't actually mess your plot. So in this case, we're just basically clipping everything or cutting everything. We're only taking data from the 2nd and 98th percentile. Okay. Okay, so that's 2D. And then let's say you actually have 3D data, but you actually want to look at multiple slices, those multiple 2D slices. The way you do that is basically through something called faceting, which the way that works is, so this is going to give me a 3D array. So this is 2 years. Remember, this is actually inclusive. So this is 2010 and then 2011 as well. And then you call plot, and then you tell Xray. So in this case, it's going to create a panel with subplots in it. And then we're telling it, we're going to use the time. So each subplot in this panel is going to correspond to a time tick label, and then we're telling it how many columns we want. So in this case, 6. So it will basically take however many time coordinate labels we have, divide by 6, and then it will basically create that will give you the number of rows, and then it'll create a grid of 6 by however many rows. So in this case, what we get is basically we're looking at a 3 data set, but then each 2D slice is basically its own subplot. So if you just wanted to do that, so you see that again, the subplots are labeled, you have a car bar at the end, and in this case, each 2D panel corresponds to a month. Yeah. So this is January 2010 through December 2011. If you want to learn more, here's a link to the documentation again. But then what if we had just done the plotting, just do nothing, don't do any subselection? What happens? Like I said, Xray will just give you a histogram, which is not really useful in this case, but it may, but that's what by default it's going to give you. Okay, let's actually do one more thing here. So we're going to open this data set here because we're going to produce a different kind of plot where we actually look at, instead of looking at the near air surface temperature, we're actually going to look at the temperature at all pressure levels. So this is actually a 4D array. So this one actually time, P11 and ln. And then now this actually, we're going to select the last time index, and then we're going to look at this region. So this is the longitude value for the Himalayas. And then we're basically going to plot a vertical profile of temperature from pole to pole through this latitude. And that's what that looks like, right? So that's the vertical profile of temperature at that particular, so yeah, longitude from pole to pole at this particular time. And one more thing, you'll see that here I provided this y increase equals to false, and the reason for that is because we basically want Xray to invert the y-axis because the pressure decreases with height. So, and also I did one more thing. You see that my mouse. Okay, I'm saving. So when I call dot plot, I'm actually saving that into a figure. And that actually gives me something that I can now actually manipulate on my own. So if you actually wanted to do customization, but you want to start with Xray, this is how you do it. So just save whatever you get from dot plot, and then this makes available axes, attributes that basically behave like matplotlib axes. Then you can start doing some customizations. Okay. So now in the last few minutes, let's actually cover interactive visualization. So everything that we've done so far for the visualization, it's basically static plots. But if you're working in a Jupyter notebook, this package called hvplot, which builds on something else called HoloViews, which is basically a collection of a bunch of web browser oriented technology for basically producing plots. And this becomes useful if you actually wanted to create quick interactive visualizations. And this is building on top of another Python library called Bokeh. You may have heard of this. If you haven't, that's fine. This package is made available in the environment. So the way we actually activate that is by importing this specific, so import hvplot.xray. This will basically make available things that are specific to Xray in our environment, because hvplot supports a bunch of other types of objects. So you can use it on pandas, NumPy, and a bunch of others. So the nice thing is that if you're to call, so in this case, instead of calling plot, we're actually going to use hvplot. And hvplot is basically using the same heuristic. So if you give it something that is more than 2D dimensions, it's going to take some time. It'll basically give you a histogram as well. But now this histogram is actually interactive. Now I can actually hover, and it will kind of give me some information. So this is just for the histogram. We actually see more interesting stuff here. Let's actually produce a 2D. In this case, I'm just selecting. So the first time. Oh yeah. So the second. time index, and then just calling the plot. So this should give me a p-color mesh. But the difference between this and the one that we produced earlier is that this one is actually interactive. So if I were to hover, it would actually kind of give me what those values are, right? So as you can see, it will tell me the longitude and latitude values and the actual temperature. And then it will also give me the color bar here. And you can use this toolbar here to actually, if you actually wanted to zoom in, can do that. It won't re-render. There's a way of actually re-rendering this on the fly, but I won't cover that. That will be a separate tutorial on its own. But this is interactive. Like basically, you could actually zoom in and it will actually re-render. So let me just go back. Okay, we can do the same thing for line plots or 1D. So this give me, so select those, so time and then longitude. And that's a line, and that line is also interactive. So I can hover it and it'll just give me the values, right? Okay. Okay, same thing. This is a time series at that particular location. It's a line plot. Okay, and now, okay, let's now cover one last thing. So as you've seen, so far we've basically, every time we've had to do some plotting, we've had to subset our data. But then one cool thing that hvplot allows us to do is that we can actually create plots on demand. And what I mean by that is hvplot will basically allow us to define like the basic plot that we're interested in, and then tell it what dimension we want to assign a widget to. And then we can actually create the creation of those plots using the widget. In this case, I'm actually going to create a 2D plot, and then I'm using the time axis to actually generate like a widget where basically each plot corresponds to a time slice. And the way that I do that, I use this group by where I'm just telling it the dimension again, so that's time. And then I'm just telling it to clip values between basically min and max. So you could just modify these. And then I'm also specifying some color map. So what I get here, it's a 2D plot, but now you see that I have one more thing. I have this slider here. And this is actually going to allow me to, so if I were to move this, this would actually create plots on demand. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this, you'll see that it's only creating plot when I actually request it to. So if I do this, you'll see that that is actually moving, meaning that it's actually retrieving the data. So I can move this around. And something else, because this is a time time dimension, the hvplot also comes with some heuristics about basically what type of widgets. In some cases, you may get like a drop down, or in this case, it's a slider. So that's something that you can actually customize. But then let's do one last thing. In this case, I don't want to have to move this slider here. I can actually create like a control widget where I can actually click play and fast forward, and it'll basically kind of go on its own. In this case, I had to specify, so it's the same plot, but then I specified the widget type, which is in this case, it's called scrubber, and then I'm telling it where to put it, which is the bottom. And now I have these controls here, so I can go, I can click play or pause or fast forward. And if I click on this, it would actually now kind of create like a movie, basically. And how do I know? So you see that the time is actually changing, and I don't have to basically move the slider myself. So there's a bunch of other stuff that you can do. So this is just like a brief overview of what is possible. And actually, that's the last thing that we're covering today. And in part 2, we're actually going to get into computation, and we will see how to basically put all this in an end-to-end example. We actually we use that near air surface temperature to do some masking. In this case, we are going to compute El Nino, so we're going to mask a particular region in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, and we're going. Okay, I hope I didn't. Yeah, okay, anyways. The point being, we're just going to compute El Nino. So we're going to have to select a region, do some climatology, and then do some plotting. And that will hopefully kind of show you how this fits in an end-to-end workflow. And with that, I'll take questions. So I'll try to answer some of the questions that get answered in the chat.
Anderson, there was a question about, can you save figures?
Okay.
And the HV plot, I think, is easy to answer.
I mean, in this case, there's actually this save icon here, but this will only save, in this case, it will only save this particular plot that we have right now.
Right.
But then in the case of matplotlib, let me scroll down here. So remember how I said that you can actually, if you do an assignment like this, you should basically be able to do, in this case, so if I were to run that, I get this figure object that save, I think, fig on this. No, there's nothing. So you can actually use, you can import matplotlib. So if you do matplotlib.pyplot as PLT, you can actually do, let me do this. In this case, I don't even need this. So in the same cell, for now, we can just do plt.save fig. And in this case, let me just do test.png. Let me specify some resolution here. And this, no, this actually not. Give me a second. Try to remember. Is it actually? Did it? Oh, it's actually not save underscore. It's actually save fig. Okay. So in this case, you'll basically, if you go here, we'll see that there's actually my figure. So this is one way you could do that. There's a bunch of other ways that you can do it. But yes, you can save figures if you wanted to. Or another way, if you're working in a notebook, you can actually click on the figure. No, actually, I think, no, never mind. I thought you could actually just click on the figure and just do save, but no, I think it looks like the interface is a bit funky, so I don't know. Anyways, yeah, so you can save figures if you wanted to.
There's a question asking about a question that was asked earlier about where you get the memory usage display in Jupyter Lab.
Okay, this doesn't come so this doesn't come with Jupyter Lab by default. I have actually an extension for that. And where did I actually put that? If you're to go to the Spindle directory in my environment.yaml file, there's this extension called Jupyter Lab System Monitor, and that's actually the one that is providing me with some of this stuff. So if you were to Google Jupyter Lab -System Monitor, it'll probably take you to the GitHub repo, and that should. If you install that in your environment, then and you launch Jupyter Lab, that should give you some information. Yeah. Any other questions?
There's a question here that's it's prefaced by saying it's irrelevant to Xray.
Okay.
It says, if I want to open Jupyter Notebook on a virtual cluster,
Okay.
should I initiate Jupyter Lab by typing Jupyter Hub? I tried initiate Jupyter Lab on Cheyenne. It did open the default web browser for me, but it responds very slowly. Will Jupyter Hub be faster?
Okay. Okay. So two answers. One, if let's say you actually wanted to launch Jupyter Lab on a remote server, so it's this package. So this is just a shameless plug called Jupyter Forward. And then the idea behind this package is that basically you tell it, so you have to have Jupyter Lab installed on the remote machine, and then you can actually tell it, here's the machine that I'm interested in. I want you to launch Jupyter. And let me go here. And basically, this is what the command would look like. You run Jupyter forward, and then your username. Let me actually increase the font here. You basically, okay, Jupyter forward, your username on the machine. Basically, the same way you would SSH. And then that actually should just be enough. And then it will basically launch Jupyter Lab on the remote server, and then it will basically do the SSH tunneling, and then it will actually open your browser. It will open the session locally in your browser. So that's if you don't have like a Jupyter Hub installation on that cluster. So if in this case, assuming you're working on Cheyenne, there's a Jupyter Hub. So the best thing to do is just go to jupyterhub.uca.edu, and that should allow you to actually get a Jupyter Lab session very easily. But then you have to be careful about basically things like environments and stuff like that, because maybe if you don't have Conda, then you may not have the right packages that you're interested in using, and that's out of scope of this tutorial. But yeah, you can install things on Cheyenne and then just launch stuff from your machine, and things will just work. But things are running remotely. Okay, I hope that helps.
And everybody keep in mind, there will be more in the next session 2 weeks from now about Xray. And then after that, we're planning on doing some Dask tutorials. And then after that, we'll even do a Xray with Dask tutorial. So lots of Xray and lots of Dask in the coming weeks.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Anderson, for that great session.
Of course.
There's another question that popped up amidst all of the thanks. Thank you, everyone. What other data formats are compatible with Xray? I'm assuming that means what other data formats can you read with Xray?
Actually, let me do a quick share again. If you go to that first notebook that we started with, there's a link here. If you click on this link, it will actually take you to the documentation page, and will actually tell you what file formats and data formats are actually supported. So there's a bunch of those. There's raster, IO. You could even use some other backends like sudo NetCDF, Pineo, Xar, and a bunch of others. But my hope is that at least this page should give you enough information about that. Okay. Any other question?
There was a question. I responded when someone asked a question about generating movies from the animations. I don't know.
Using hvplot or using matplotlib? Because
yeah, they're different. I think the question came up when you were doing the animation with hvplot.
So you mean here? Okay.
Yeah, that one.
So what is the interest to save this movie? Or
yeah, to save the movie.
Okay, again, I think that's out of scope of this tutorial. At least it's more involved. And unfortunately, we don't have time, but we can cover this in a dedicated session if people are interested in
right.
this.
And I provided a link to Julius's X movie.
Yeah, and that one is
package.
matplotlib based. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's so. But no, I don't think we have any particular plans on covering X movie in our tutorials here.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, I think it's fine. Movies are one of those things that I think there have been lots of different ways of solving that problem. And I'm sure if you look around, you'll probably find many different solutions.
Mm-hmm.
But Xmovie is a fairly recent solution that works nicely with Xray directly.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, thank you, everyone. See you in 2 weeks.
Yep. Take care, everyone.